Kids these days, they're soft. Now, this is a phrase many listeners of the podcast have likely heard and possibly used themselves. And honestly, I might have thought it once or twice myself, and yet the more clinical scientific word would be fragile. Kids today are soft. Now, rather than just sitting around and complaining about the way things are in kids these days, like we as coaches need to reflect, how are things working out for us? Like when we just operate with this mindset and just continue to complain. The reality is they're not probably working out too well, so we need to adjust. Well, the question is, what's a better way? Now, today's conversation and the next episode's conversation with Dr. Nick Holton is going to be one that will help us to stop complaining about the fragility of people today and to start to create an environment of support and challenge that helps develop anti-fragility. Nick works as a consultant, a coach, a speaker, and author, focusing on scientific research that facilitates and supports optimal functioning, a synergistic development of both peak performance and overall happiness and satisfaction. He's worked with NBA athletes, NCAA programs, Fortune 500 businesses, as well as individuals from some of the most well-known firms in the world. I enjoyed this interview so much that I immediately subscribed to his podcast after listening back to Betsy and Nate's interview. So I know you're going to enjoy today's episode. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nerman, and our mission here is simple. We want to help coaches become better leaders and build better team cultures. Our hosts of today's interview are my good friends Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. And if you're interested in learning more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or if you want to explore our online courses and books, well, just head on over to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. While you're at tocculture.com, do not forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It's packed with notes from each podcast episode, our latest articles, and practical culture building tips.
Well, Nick, it's great to have you on the podcast here. We've been looking forward to this one. I know it's been a bit of a challenge trying to get all of our time zones lined up here, but glad to have you on the podcast here this morning. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a coach ask me, how do we get our players to be more resilient? And that's what we're going to talk about here today in the coaching context here. But I'd like maybe just for you to introduce yourself a little bit here and maybe give some background to the listener, and then we'll dive into kind of these ideas of fragility and anti-fragility.
Sure. Well, first, Nate, Betsy, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here as well. I've been looking forward to the conversation. So in terms of my background, I'll try to keep it pretty concise, but I've got now really a combined kind of 30 plus years experience really in the world of, say, like self-development, right? Personal development. And that's both as a classroom teacher, as a athletic coach, and now as sort of a peak performance coach at kind of, let's say, high levels with high level execs, right? And so I try to bring that lens along with my doctorate in psychology to really the question of like human potential, right? And what we really need to help, and I'm most interested in young people, what we really need to help young people learn and understand at ages when their neuroplasticity is higher, they're a little more malleable, they're deciding values, they're figuring it out, right? What do we need to help them learn and understand so that they can kind of feel their best and perform their best, right? And so, like the long and short of it is, that is what I do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's through programming, coaching, consulting, podcasting. It's really kind of this movement of human potential, right? And peak capacities, if you will. And that means a whole bunch of different things. And then we'll get into the nuances of that. But that kind of breaks down into two subcategories. One is flourishing or thriving, build the good, understand the science that generally predicts a good quality of life for most people. And there's a lot of individual variance within that. But then the other piece you sort of asked about that we'll get into a little bit more is responding to or preparing for the bad. And that's kind of a nice natural bridge into some distinctions there if you want to go there, but I'll pause.
Yeah, why don't we start there a little bit with the language here of fragility, maybe begin with that. Just give a coaches kind of an understanding of what do we mean when we use this word fragility.
Yeah. So let's start with kind of the spectrum you'll see in a lot of the, let's say, peer-reviewed papers, but also in Nicholas Taleb's original work, Anti-fragile, from 2012. One far end of the spectrum, you've got fragile. You referenced it, right? So with a fragile person, fragile personality, say fragile mindset, adversity strikes, right? And it's usually that it strikes, not that they engage with it, right? The fragile person's usually not seeking adversity. That's part of the personality, right? Generally speaking, of course. But so that adversity strikes, something happens to them that is adverse and unpleasant, they crumble, they fall apart, right? So you can imagine the host of things that that comes with: mental health associated, performance associated, lack of growth, all the things, right? So then you kind of move a little further down the spectrum, you get to resilience. And this is like, there's so much out there about resilience. This is where like, and people are going to have their camps, like with anything, but there's a couple buckets you can generally break it down into. So resilience, first and foremost, I think of as reactive. So something has occurred as opposed to I've sought it out. That's going to be an important distinction in just a second, right? Reactive versus proactive. And then really it breaks down into kind of two subtypes: robustness and buoyancy. And so robustness is sort of this imperviousness, right? Like I don't really take a hit so much when the bad thing happens because I'm robust. I've got this stealing effect, right? Sort of in place. Buoyancy is I take a hit, but there's a rebounding, right? I get back to baseline. And how resilient I am might depend on how long it takes for me to do that or how effectively I do that relative to the intensity of the adversity, right? But either way, you're really kind of reactive in those situations and you're trying to navigate stuff that's unpleasant, okay? So just notice the framing already that I've laid out so far: unpleasant versus negative, right? When we talk about fragility and resilience, the implicit message is that things that are unpleasant are bad. And we need to either avoid them or recover from them as quickly as possible, right? And I'm not necessarily arguing that, but those nuances are going to be important with the next term, which is anti-fragility. So anti-fragility, first and foremost, is proactive, right? It is a capacity that we would build, right, through behaviors, personality traits, habits, routines, etc., that allows us to not just be resilient in the face of adversity, but to actually thrive through it. And in some cases, maybe even because of it. And that's a completely different paradigm shift in how we think about unpleasant experiences, which is totally understandable because the far intense end of unpleasant experiences are truly dangerous, right? In all sorts of ways. But I think we've maybe thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. And so we're trying to help overcorrect and we're trying to really just lend good science to doing so. And so that's kind of the basic spectrum.
So let's drill this into an athletic example. So you think of an athlete that, and maybe just use a couple examples on that spectrum that you just talked about. How does this manifest in sport as you see it?
Yeah, let's take this one just randomly popped into my head. Well, there's a couple actually. Let's go with your sport first, Nate. So basketball. Damian Lillard. Okay. Literally, what's his nickname? Dame Time. Right? Why? He's known as clutch. Right? In the psychological literature, what is clutch? Clutch is being able to perform at your peak in the moment needed, despite how you feel. That's different than flow. Flow generally feels really good. Flow is more like in the zone. You don't have to be in the zone to be clutch. They're not the same thing, right? So, okay, why do I bring that up? Well, he's got this famous quote that I love using, and we've actually got it up on our social from a couple weeks ago. Basically, he talks about the way he grew up in the Bay Area, Betsy, right? And kind of what he had to go through. He basically was like, pressure? I don't feel pressure. Pressure's the single mom trying to put food on her table. Pressure's the like trying to survive a day, whatever it might be. And he lays out these examples. And the reason I bring this up is what the research suggests is that, listen, I'm not advocating for what he had to deal with, true trauma in many cases. But these adverse experiences, when incorporated and processed and framed in certain ways, can actually create what's known as a stealing effect. It can create more resilience, more robustness, kind of more of that imperviousness later on. And so what do you see on a cognitive and physiological profile of a Damian Lillard in clutch time? You don't see elevated levels of stress. You see excitement and opportunity stress, which is a different, right? Hormonally, it's a different type of stress. It's a different makeup. And that's because he's receiving that in a way that he can only receive because he's built up these capacities over time, essentially through exposure, right? So hopefully that contextualizes it. I was also going to mention on a simple level, Ray Allen. Like Ray Allen's not just shooting threes. He is sprinting all over the damn place, running through blockers with bags, knocking them off, right? That famous shot, the most famous shot he will ever have, right? Against the Spurs. There's a famous story about it. He was practicing those shots. You can see that in warm up. That's planning for uncertainty. That's planning for volatility. That's planning for unpredictability. It's putting in the reps for something that's actually really unlikely to happen, right? And there's a proactive nature to that, not reactive. So hopefully those two on different levels help to kind of give a little bit more detail.
And there's, Nick, there's so much I want to talk about here. And thank you for laying a baseline to give us an understanding of what are we talking about when we talk about fragility, anti-fragility, how does it relate to resilience? A question that comes up often with some of the coaches that I work with, the teams that I work with, is a kind of old school understanding of, well, if we put people through enough hard things, they become resilient. But what we're seeing with a lot of kids these days is simply putting them through hard things is actually depleting their felt capacity to succeed. And then we're seeing increases in anxiety, increases in depression, rises in challenges regarding their own mental health. And so there's this other school of thought that increasing the level of support or the avenues for support is part of what's necessary to build resilience in today's young people. Given the research, given your experience in the field, what have you found to be true currently? Is how do we build resilience in young people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the science and then the anecdata, right? Because what I didn't really mention my background is 15 plus years, like high level club soccer coach, ran recruiting camps. I've sent players, in NWSL right now, in D1, all those sorts of things, won a couple state titles. So like I've been in the coach's seat. Right. And both, I think, from the anecdata, that experience, and the science, there's a distinction you want to remember, which is the difference between a facilitative environment and an unrelenting environment. And so if you can picture, and your listeners can picture, a 2x2 grid, right, which is really levels of challenge or ease by levels of support. What you want is high challenge, high support. You do not want low challenge. That's not interesting to people. That doesn't bring growth. Notice you actually have to have unpleasantness, because if it's not unpleasant, it ain't a challenge, right? But the key here is it supported by, say, the coaches, so externally, the parents externally, and or internally through skills and capacities. And if we, throw, say, the student metaphorically into the pool, like, you better hope they know how to tread water. And if they don't, the coach or the parent better be ready to jump in, right? And that's essentially what we're doing if we throw them into, let's say, these anti-fragile or resilience boosting scenarios with little to no support system. That's definitely problematic, right? That might be an unrelenting environment. The other thing to keep in mind is, like, all of these things should always be cyclical. So there should be a start and a stop. So, to your point or your comment earlier, Betsy, about young people, like, maybe it's a lack of confidence, right? But it also, like, are they underslept? Are they overworked? Right? Are they, there's all these different potential variables at play that kind of might interact there.
That's really helpful. I think even the nuances you're mentioning of there's a start and stop, right? It's not a continuous state. And I think that sometimes when I hear about the stress levels of young people, or, a coach makes us do all these hard things, there's not a clear framing of one purpose. Here's why we're doing the hard things. They understand that challenge is necessary for growth at a high level, but what does it look like and feel like? What's my experience of it in this context with this coach, with this team? Do I know that there's an endpoint? Do I understand the purpose? Am I building resilience versus just being, like you said, thrown in? And they haven't asked if I know how to doggy paddle. They've just assumed that I'll figure it out. So I think the nuances are really helpful in this case. Thank you.
So let's talk about a term called chosen suffering, but we'll come back to it in just a second. I think it's worth mentioning really quick just before and I think I've already started to do it, but I want to make sure I do it explicitly, what anti-fragility or resilience is not, because I think this is still pretty present in coaching culture in a lot of circles. And it is not the idea that somebody is just impenetrable, impervious to pain, mentally tough, right? For like just never feel anything. That is wildly unhealthy for the vast majority of human beings, right? And so that it's important because we've used this word soft a couple of times, which is a good word to talk about and use. It's understandable, but I'm also going to paint a picture. How might you describe a rubber band? I'd be curious to see what you both say, right? Is that soft?
I would say flexible. That's the first word that comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah. Same for me. How about you, Nate?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought.
And that's what we want. And it's a small distinction, right? Soft versus flexibility. But either way, neither of those is rigid. Neither of those is just, you can't, right, hurt me. It's emotionally aware and in tune. It's mindfully present. It's being able to regulate and control. It's identifying values and knowing what you stand for, regardless of how certain things feel, right? It's not just grit and bear it and hope for the best, right? So just that distinction, I think, is really important, okay? So then you go to what you just alluded to, and there's a great term from Paul Bloom, who's at Yale as a psychologist. He's got a good book called The Sweet Spot, and he talks about chosen suffering. And so why should we bring up chosen suffering? So far, the general idea for these coaches is like, there is some utility in unpleasantness. Fear that I might not get some playing time is okay in some cases, right? A little anxiety that I might not make the team might spur a little more training. I might get up 10 minutes earlier to do the thing, whatever it is, right? Like, I think we should be sad when we lose a game that we could have won, right? There are utility in these things. But if they are unrelenting, not cyclical, and I like the word you used, Betsy, without purpose and meaning, right, subjectively by the athlete, then all it is suffering. It's not chosen suffering. There's nothing to do with it. It just sucks. It just feels like shit, right? And so coaches out there, like, yes, it should always be not just, hey, go do this. Here's why we are doing this. Here is the end goal of the suffering you are about to endure. And we can just talk about it openly, right, and honestly. And then kind of, maybe we try to differentiate as well. Like, we can get into that more. Like, that's kind of a nerdy thing. But the idea is that there's some sort of chosen element. So like the classic example is parents, right? Probably assume a lot of your audience, in addition to being coaches, are parents. Parents generally, happiness levels go up. Happiness levels go down. Meaning levels go up. So what's the difference? Chosen suffering. Right? Happiness is kind of hedonistic. A lot of new parents don't look at that and say, yeah, that's a ton of pleasure. Right? It's a lack of sleep and it's a ton of stress. And I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but man, does meaning go through the roof. Chosen suffering, purposeful suffering, some element of sacrifice involved, right? That's where you see challenges, the utility of unpleasantness. And by the way, that's highly associated with mental health as well. It's got to be a both and emotional agility, cognitive flexibility, that rubber band.
Well, Nick, let's take a specific example here. So my basketball team this year, we were ranked second in the state in the preseason polls. And so we got a chance to have a special year here. And so we decided to really schedule a tough non-conference slate. So we're
great.
3A team. We played 4A number 8 on Saturday. We play 5A number 7 next week. We play 3A number 1. We play a 5A school after that. And then we get into our conference schedule, which is a good league, but it's not that level night in and night out. So if you were coaching me on how to prepare our team, our athletes, for what we're about to go through here in the preseason non-conference schedule, what would you say?
Oh man, that's such a good context and case scenario. Right? So it's worth talking about a framework that we use real quick, which is top down, bottom up, outside in. It's biopsychosocial. The environment matters. You're not going to help them be resilient or happy or anti-fragile in a vacuum, right? The friends that they're surrounded with, the parents they're surrounded with, these things matter. So in the perfect world, parent education is a part of this as well, and parent buy-in, right? So the whole shit's kind of moving in the same direction. But then the second thing I'd say is then you've got layers, because you are simultaneously, Nate, trying to build an anti-fragile unit, right? A resilient unit, a high-performing unit, and individuals within that unit, right? And so I'll give you a simple kind of side story here that I think helps articulate this. 1930s, there's a professor from Washington State that travels to Southeast Asia. He's floating down a river. As he's floating down the river, he noticed this mangrove tree lights up as if it had been struck by a bolt of lightning, right? Does this a couple more times, and then all of a sudden the entire embankment lights up, right? Kind of in unison. So he floats over, takes a look, checks it out, and he sees that it's fireflies. And as we now know, like fireflies sometimes flash and sink, but that was really not known then. So he comes back to the States, he writes up a nerdy paper about it, gets it published in Science, and most people don't believe him, right? Why? Well, what's the point of a firefly flashing? To attract a mate. Why would you do that in the same way and same time as all the other fireflies? That doesn't seem like a good way to distinguish oneself, right? But what we have now found after decades of research is that when the fireflies do flash and sink, their chances of success go up about 80%. And so when I come back to your team, you have two questions. How do I get all the fireflies to flash? And then how do I get them in sync? Right? And there's layers to this. Okay. And so if we kind of went layer by layer, and I told you earlier, I'm a Michigan State grad, right? 3 times. And I was in the ISO in all 4 years of undergrad. So like, what is one of the things ISO is famous for? A brutal start of the year schedule, right? And so what are the factors you might consider? Well, on a group level, is that what we would call the rubber band, a stretch activity, or are they snap activities? Will the kids be so overwhelmed and the pressure be so unrelenting that it potentially breaks some of them? Their confidence, where they thought they were at, et cetera, or makes them doubt the unit. And so some of it is, yes, take those swings, and then some of it is try to take those swings at scale, right? The other piece of it, though, is you've got the individuals. Well, that might be overwhelming for some individuals on the team. In fact, it should be, right? Your bench probably, all due respect to the players that are coming in right off the bench, is probably, in theory, not the same level and may be ready for those, whatever it was, 5A sort of like matches, okay? And so there, you're kind of saying, okay, well, I'm going to prioritize the unit and these 3, 4, 5, 6 starters, right, that are ready for it. And hopefully the ones are, we're going to pull them along the way, right? But in an individual capacity, you might have to work with each starter in a slightly different way on their inner game, right? On their bottom up, their body game. You might have to have specific conversations with 1 or 2 people's parents outside in a way that's a little different with it, right? And so I think you're always doing this dance between the me and the we, the individual and the unit, but you're trying then to scale difficulty, right? You're trying to scale uncertainty. And so it's not just the scheduling, then it's how you prepare for those games, right? You're all of a sudden throwing in full court presses and traps you typically don't see, right? Because the kids don't know it, but in a couple weeks, one of these teams is going to run it. And you're not going to say anything. You're just throwing that in there. We're going to see how they react, right? And then it's okay, you reacted a certain way, and like, hey, John, you panicked like hell. Remember what we talked about just like mindful presence and like just take a breath, right? Those sorts of things.
Let me give you a couple of things that we've done, and you can tell me if I'm on the right track or not here. But
Okay.
Certainly just the framing, we talked, like Bruce Perry talks about the predictability of stress, and understanding, as you said, this is a cycle, but there's a purpose, right? So I use a story with our kids about actually JP when he ran a ultra marathon a year ago, never had done one before, but he did a half one first. and only had trained for 2/3 of that distance. And so I wrote this article about that, about his experience, because essentially it was, we just have to see what breaks so we can fix it before we need it. And so we kind of use that as our analogy here of, I don't want to wait till January to figure out what we need to get better at. I want to learn as much about ourselves, about us, as I can as quickly as possible, so we have as much time before the state tournament, to get ready. And that's been the embrace, at least in the framing to begin.
No, I think that's it. I don't have much to add there. I mean, I think you put it really succinctly, right? Now we can start to take it layers deeper, more nuanced. Like, what do we mean by, for instance, when you're throwing them into those games, you're not just hoping they're learning from adversity. You're probably guessing there's some weak spots. You want to see those get exposed and then consciously try to address them, I would imagine, right? And so you can name those weak spots. It's granular, it's specific, it's detailed. And then ideally, you have a plan for addressing it after the fact, as opposed to, Betsy, you asked about environments, right? So unrelenting environments would be, hey, here's the 518, good luck.
Right.
No prep, no follow-up, no reflection, no adjustment, right? That ain't support, right? So it's a good way of, I think, concretizing a few different things we've talked about already. And better yet, if you can also make sure you're helping the kids frame it by getting excited about it, they might ideally, they're going to get the crap kicked out of them a couple times, but hopefully they're excited about the adversity and the process and the challenge, and see the purpose of it throughout the season, which brings us back to the chosen suffering element as well, right?
Right. And I think there's some art to the follow-up to that too. So we played the first game on Saturday and lost by 9. And one of the things that I did was and I do this a lot now, but I just told our players, hey, either grab me on the way out, or you've got 24 hours to text me 2 thoughts about the game. So that helps me understand how, as you said, each of those individuals is processing either their own experience or the collective experience. And then when we meet and go through the film on Monday, now I've got a much better sense in the room of what I need to do to make sure that we're framing and correcting is not even the right word, but we're just speaking to places where it needs to be spoken to. And then in the film, I pulled 60 clips of things we could have done better, but we just picked 2 things that will make the biggest difference the fastest. So we focused on post-entry passing. That was 10 clips. And we focused on giving up offensive rebounds where we were almost in the right place. We just, it's like we're right there. We just didn't push back. And if we do those 2 things, that's 15-point difference in a 9-point game. Just those 2 little things. Right. And then we grow toward the next game.
100%. Yep. All part of the process, which we can get into more. But when we start talking about, kind of the personality indicators, if you will, one of those is going to be like a growth mindset and a learning orientation. It's not stagnant. It's optimistic, it's forward moving, it's engaging, it's not kind of sitting back, waiting and hoping.
All right, that's the end of part 1 of Nate and Betsy's conversation with Nick. Next episode, we'll be back to discuss how to build an anti-fragile team and how a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work when it comes to mental health and mental performance. Now, if you enjoyed this podcast, well, you need to be subscribed and reading our weekly newsletter. The newsletter shares a weekly article with practical tools and advice on building team culture. There's discounts on online courses and the notes to each episode of the podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast newsletter at tocculture.com. Thanks for listening in to the Coaching Culture Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast as well, and share this episode with friends in coaching if you found it valuable.